Good evening, friends. Welcome to Fireside Chat number, I don't know how many of these chats that we've done. I am so delighted to have a guest with us. He will be preaching this Sunday at University Church at our 11 o'clock service online, Reverend Ray Jordan. Ray, delighted to have you with us.
So happy to be here.
So Ray, I'm going to give you just a few minutes to rest and gather your what does it say? Gird your loins. Is that the biblical phrase? Okay, no idea what that means. Yeah, and we'll just wait for a few more people to get on the link. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about UUMC stuff. You had asked earlier what we had worked on, and we have a pretty long history of working on racism, although maybe not very successfully. I know that Dr. Heinsohn, who was the pastor back in the 50s, he was kind of instrumental in welcoming Black students to University Church and allowing them to join the church and be part of the church and all that, because that was a little bit controversial back in the 50s.
Sure.
UT was just being integrated, and so it was something that came up at one of the church council meetings. What are we going to do? And somebody said, I think we should leave it with our pastor. And so it was left with Dr. Heinsohn. I know in the 60s, Bob Bryan, who was our kind of a campus minister, he got our members involved in helping desegregate restaurants and movie theaters. There's a movie theater right across the street from the church, former movie theater, the Varsity Theater. And they did stuff like they would get in line, and then they would go up to the front and ask to sit in the balcony or to sit on the main floor, and they weren't allowed to, and so they would get back in line again, and folks from the church would bring them chocolate and all that, and so they were just kind of, mildly harassing the theater to try to make a point.
Mm-hmm.
We've had study groups, we've had a lot of work sessions, we've had a long collaboration with Wesley United Methodist Church, which is a historically Black church, letters, calls. Every year we march in the MLK Day parade, and we also have had involvement from a lot of members in the protests recently. Just a couple of announcements to go over. So there's, while we're still waiting for folks to get on, we're going to have an invitation to justice over the next over the next 3 weeks, and we're going to be suggesting readings. We're going to suggest ways to interact. And then also, Deaconess Kristen Bowdry was going to host a teach-in, and that will be next week. I don't have all the details in front of me. I didn't successfully grab them, so. But we're trying to do this work in June. We've done it for a long time in the church, but we're trying, my hope is always that it's just not like checking a box, like, oh yeah, all that happened, and check, we did stuff in June, but that we all begin to develop these habits to make this like a permanent part of our being. So let me give you your formal introduction. Ray, again, we're so glad to have you back here. Pastor Jordan is the United Church of Christ clergy person. And did you grow up in the United Methodist Church? I can't remember.
I did. I did.
Okay. And so you're another one of the good ones that got away. But we know you're doing great in UCC Church, and we love that church. You were formerly senior pastor at Central Congregational UCC in Dallas. I know that you're invited to all kinds of places, a preacher, workshop leader, and a facilitator. And you've got multiple degrees, including you got an MTS from Perkins School of Theology, and then working on your PhD from Union Institute and University, with an emphasis, I think, still on public policy and social change. Okay. What point are you at in your grad program? Are you close, or?
I am ABD, which means, for those who are unaware of that academic language, it's all the dissertation. I've got about 100 pages written, and so now I just need to do some editing and go through the hazing process, is what I call it.
That's true. Oh, that's great. So, you're currently teaching at well, I guess you're not teaching now. You're probably on a summer break, and probably most important of all, you're the father of 3 beautiful children. So again, we're inviting Ray to be a part of the Fireside Chat tonight, and he will be a guest preacher on Sunday morning, this Sunday, at our 11 o'clock church. We're continuing our series, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. I'll throw you a softball. What's your title for this Sunday, and what are you preaching on, Ray?
Oh, I am preaching from the book of Galatians, and the title loosely is It's Time. It's time. And so we're talking a little bit about seasons and times, and I'm asking the question, and particularly asking University Church, what time is it? And can we tell the time spiritually? Are we able to discern it? So that's just a bit.
Oh, I love it. I can't wait. I can't wait to hear it. Yeah, I look forward to that. One of the things that I try to do is, in order to try to be a half decent ally, is that I'm always looking at lists of things where they offer for pastors, particularly about what can you do as a pastor. And one of the things that we're always urged to do is to have persons of color in our pulpit and not just have, white person after white person. So you're also part of that, and you're a friend of the congregation, a great friend of Lisa's. So you were just
Indeed.
to come in and talk with us a little bit about anti-racism. I guess let's start the questioning with this one. Your experiences in Dallas, you've been involved in some of the peaceful protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. Can you share a little bit of your experiences and what that's been like for you?
Certainly. I want to begin, of course, by thanking you for allowing me to have this space and this really sacred space and time with you. I want to thank you and the church for its long history in anti-racism and solidarity ally work. And that gets me in trouble sometimes. So any movement, no movement is monolithic. There are always different voices competing for ideas and strategy. And sometimes the idea is that we should not thank white allies in this work, or straight allies, or whatever allies it may be, because that's what you're supposed to be doing. I remember when my children were young, and someone would say, "Oh, you're babysitting," and their mother would say, "No, no, 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 no. He's a dad. That's what he's supposed to do." But I still, I grew up in Arkansas, and I'm a Southerner by really nature and mannerism. And so maybe it's just the Southern hospitality manners that I feel like you ought to say thank you, because yes, people of color did not create racism. Therefore, we should not be expected to dismantle it alone. It was a phenomenon created by Europeans, not by persons of color. Yet, I also understand that as we all have a certain level of privilege in some space. And when we, as human beings that have agency, decide to place our privilege aside and join as an ally with a movement, I think it's okay to say thank you. And we ought to be able to say that. That reminds me of some of the protests that we've seen in the city of Dallas, and of course around the world, literally around the world, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, senseless killing. And that is that the movement has not been monolithic in ethnicity or race or expression of any kind. So last weekend, the weekends are kind of running together. Maybe it wasn't last weekend, maybe it was a couple of weeks ago. I was involved in the city of Dallas and in some protest rallies. First, it was a Saturday, so it would be almost 2 weeks ago, Saturday. My children and I, my adult children are 21 and almost 20, and they said, "Dad, let's go out." And I was feeling a little tired, but I said, you know what? The children will lead us. So I said, you're right. We need to go out. We need to be a part. And I wasn't keen on being part of a night activity, but that's when they wanted to go. And so I said, well, let's do it. I can be a part of that. As a student and an academic of the civil rights movement, I understand that any march activity is always a bit more dangerous. So I'm coming from that perspective. Yet I wanted to kind of honor the request of my kiddos. And so we went. To make a long story short, we were not involved in anything organized. There were a lot of people on the streets in downtown Dallas. There was no curfew at this particular point, as many cities did experience at some point. Yet, as we were walking on the sidewalk in downtown Dallas, lots of police presence, there was a tank, a military combat style machine emerged on the streets of Dallas. And my son and I found ourselves at the end of the tank gun. I call it a missile launcher. I'm not sure exactly what the correct word is, but it's the long gun thing pointing at you. And in that moment, again, we were not a part of anything organized. We were looking for something organized to join, but at this point, we were just citizens walking the streets. And this tank gun pointed at us, and I said out loud, "Oh my God, are they going to shoot us in the streets?" Well, they did fire upon us, but it was not bullets, thankfully. It was rubber bullets and tear gas. But we were on the streets of Dallas, just as citizens being tear gassed and fired upon with no warning, no announcement that we were somehow trespassing or violating some law or order, just fired upon. That was Saturday.
Incredible.
Of that particular week. 2 days later, which was a Monday, and forgive me, I can't remember the exact date, I joined a protest at the city hall during the day. As I got, not city hall, it was at the police department, the headquarters downtown of the police department. Once my children and I got there, we were told by the organizers that a curfew had now been placed by the mayor and that we needed to move outside of the curfew zone. And so we did that. The whole gathering moved to the city courthouse, and it was outside of the zone. There was lots of police presence. We had a rally in which I was a speaker for a couple of hours, and then I attempted to leave because it was becoming night, and I already explained to you that having already been tear gassed for no apparent reason on the streets of Dallas 2 days prior, I told my kiddos, let's go home. When I went to the parking garage to retrieve my car from the public parking garage, we were told by police we could not leave, that they had been told by higher ups that we had to stay, and no car could leave until the protest was over. While I thought that was odd, we thought, well, okay, there was going to be some type of march after the rally. So we decided, well, since we have to be here anyway, we might as well join the march. We were ushered onto what's called in Dallas the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge, one of 3 kind of new bridges that were built in recent years. Literally ushered, being told, keep moving. Once we got on the bridge, we encountered police in riot gear from the front and the back. So we have the Trinity River on either sides of us because we're on a bridge. We have police on riot gear in the front and back. After literally being ushered to that bridge, when we got to the bridge, the lights on the bridge went out. And I thought, again, naively, that's odd. And then my daughter says to me, you know, Dad, this might not be a good idea because, you know, we're on a bridge. They could surround us. And literally within 5 minutes of my daughter saying that, that's exactly what happened. They began to fire upon us for no cause, tear gas, smoke bombs to obstruct our viewpoint, the tear gas, which began to suffocate us. And then they began to fire rubber bullets, in which I was struck in the leg with a rubber bullet. Others were struck. One peaceful protester lost his eye. And this technique, I later learned, is called kettling, where you are surrounded, and it does not persons who criticize this police tactic. It does not de-escalate the situation. In fact, it creates chaos. It creates aggression because they're choking, they can't see. On that bridge, it was national news. Some persons may have seen it. Persons were vomiting. They were having seizures induced by the tear gas. And we were detained, and many were arrested because I had my minor son, who's 16, was with me. Our information was taken and we were let go. Just in the middle of the night, we had to just walk off the bridge with nowhere to go. Thankfully, I did have a friend who lived nearby, and we were able to walk to his home. But that's been the experience. And then subsequent to that, I've been involved in other rallies that were peaceful, no aggression, been asked to speak at a number of events. But in that moment, the two things that stand out to me is what I said in the beginning of our talk, was that it was not monolithic. I was heartened that there were Black people and white people and Latinx folks and queer folks and all kind, and Asian American folks and Native American folks. I was heartened by that. It was not a monolithic movement. In all of my work in anti-racism and justice work, you rarely see that. Usually you have the target group with a few allies mixed in. What I've seen in recent weeks has been a complete tapestry of diverse Americans, which has heartened me. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. So thank you for allies for helping. The second thing that sticks in my mind is that in that moment when that tank pointed its gun at me and I said, oh my gosh, are they going to shoot us and kill us in the street? I thought also in that second, my country has declared war on me. Mm. And that's not something that most Americans consider. That yes, the country may be at war, but very few of us have had the instance in which we've had a gut check, mm-hmm. a visceral reaction to where we, like I did in that moment, thought, oh my God, the United States of America has declared war on me. What did I do? Yeah. I'm simply walking down the street with my children. Wow. So that's a bit of what we've experienced in Dallas, at least personally, in recent weeks.
Wow. Well, I certainly hope we've had similar problems in Austin with police, and now there's a lot of questions about the police chief, that perhaps he needs to resign. The city manager, mm-hmm. Is that the same kind of thing happening in Dallas? Is there some accountability?
It is. We have a new police chief, the first African-American woman to lead the police department in Dallas. Lots of people welcome that and with open arms. She came from Detroit, and after the events I just described happened, I was watching the news and saw that the Detroit chief of police took a very different approach. He chose not to enforce the curfew as long as people were being peaceful. He chose to participate and be in solidarity with the marchers, to support them and to protect and serve them, not to antagonize them. And I thought, wow, why didn't our police chief learn that in Detroit when she was there? What's the disconnect? Yeah. She has made some statements prior that maybe they're true to her understanding, but for instance, she said she gave the order that no one was to walk upon the bridge. That is not what anyone that was present heard. Mm-hmm. And so there have been lots of conversation about, mm-hmm. it's not necessarily a black and white, excuse the pun, problem. It's a systematic problem. There is systematic and institutionalized racism that it doesn't matter if you or I would be leading any given police department. There are still institutional policies in the way the system is created. I heard many persons say recently, the system is not broken. It's actually working the way it was intended. Yeah. Most people don't know that the state police in most states began as slave patrols. Mm-hmm. The Texas Rangers in their origin began as basically keeping Native Americans and African Americans in place as patrols. So that it's baked into the system. Yeah. So when people say we need to defund the police, rhetoric is important and words matter. That maybe isn't the wisest choice of words, mm-hmm. particularly in an election year. But with that aside, what that basically means is we need to reprioritize the funding of the police. That's really what that means. And so from a public policy perspective, there are three ways in which you can address the police. You can, number one, reform, which means you critique policies already in place. We've seen that reform hasn't necessarily worked.
Right.
or gone far enough, possibly. Then there is defund. To defund means to take the money and reprioritize.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of having police officers in schools, how about using some of those funds to place psychologists and social workers in schools? There are schools without nurses,
Mm-hmm.
but yet they have armed police officers. How do we reprioritize that money? Instead of having police come when there's a mental health, the top two calls for 911 are physical health issues and mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
If you can redirect police away from mental health calls and actually send mental health professionals,
Mm-hmm.
you could be using that money more wisely. That's what defund means. And then lastly, there is an option to dismantle police departments. It is so rarely done. I think the only one that I know of in recent memory in the last 15 or so years was Camden, New Jersey.
Okay.
They had such an issue with corruption in their police department. They dismantled it. And what that meant was they fired everybody and then asked the police officers to reapply. You really have to fight the police unions to do that. But that's like a last resort option.
Mm-hmm.
Fire everybody and then take everyone on a case-by-case basis and rehiring them, and then totally reforming what the police are meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
So those are really the three ways that we can handle the police. And unfortunately, it does not always matter the race or the background of the police officer,
right?
Because there is the system is corrupt in a way. I won't say broken because it's really working the way it was intended, but it's certainly broke. It's certainly problematic.
Yeah, yeah. So just a reminder to folks who are listening in, Kristen Bowdry, who is a deaconess at University Church, is going to lead a teach-in next week. So look in the eConnection for details on that. And it's specifically on what you were just talking about police and what some of that terminology means. Because there's a lot of conversation about that in Austin. You've mentioned several times, just in what you were talking about racism being systemic, that racism is baked into the system. And I guess when I look at the system, when people in my church look at it, we see that, and we have a hard time understanding how people don't see that. You may have students, or maybe you've run into folks who say, I don't believe in systemic racism. You know, there's some bad apples out there, some rotten apples, but you know, it's not really in the system. And you know, you say it's in the system, that just takes away responsibility for people to, you know, take responsibility for their lives. So how would you respond to somebody who says, I just don't believe in systemic racism?
Mm-hmm. It's hard because that's not a simple conversation, nor is it a brief one, because systematic or institutional racism is deeply connected to history. And those persons who are unaware of history and their contemporary indications won't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you educate someone on 400 years of American history in one conversation in ways that transform their thinking and their heart about a particular issue? It's very difficult. I will say that yes, the American electorate is one of the most ill-informed or uninformed electorates. And I think our present political atmosphere will show that we don't know what a fact is anymore. We don't know we have this whole idea of alternative facts and fake news. And so it's really manifesting in a really problematic way, that we're so ill-informed, and it's hard to get informed because we're being told we can't trust the media, and the media is the enemy of the people. And so it makes the water so much more muddy. I have yet to find a person who doesn't believe that the black and white experience is somehow different.
Okay.
To the extent of how different it is, I always cut right to the chase. I try to find, how do you get right to what my grandmother would call the nitty gritty, you know? And I think about President Kennedy in his address behind the desk in the Oval Office to the nation about a potential civil rights bill. And so lots had happened in the civil rights era between his in his election. I think this address was in 1962 or 3. I think it was 63 before his assassination. And as he is laying out the case for a civil rights bill, he says, if you don't believe, talking to the American people, particularly to the white Americans, if you don't believe there's an issue, that there's systematic racism, in other words, who among you would be willing to change places with the Negro? And that was the language of the day.
Yeah.
Who among you would say, okay, it's really easy to be Black in America. There's absolutely no issue at all. I'm willing, sign me up. I'll change places. I'll become Black in America. I haven't found a white person yet who wants to do that, who thinks it would be an easy exchange. And that's one way I try to cut to the chase. I don't often, it's part of my privilege of being an academic and being a preacher. I'm usually speaking. And so it's a privilege to be the one speaking. And so that comes with a little bit of authority where people respect you, or at least they're kind to you if you're in a group speaking. So I don't often encounter persons who are totally clueless with systematic racism. But when I do, because I did grow up in the rural South, and I still have friends and classmates where we see these issues very differently. That's one of the things I pose is, in the words of President Kennedy, we want to change places? You want to be Black in America for a few years? See how you like it?
Yeah.
Well, then their tune often changes about, well, maybe there's a little bit.
Right.
They'll concede a bit.
Yeah, that's a great way to approach that. I really like that. So getting back to kind of some terminology, one of the things that one of the books that we've been working through, we have an anti-racism group that meets, and we're kind of educating ourselves and getting involved. Some people are involved in the Austin Justice Coalition and listening in on Black Lives Matter meetings to the extent that we can participate in those meetings. And so we've just been reading Ibram Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist. And one of the things that he raises is there's a difference between being a non-racist and being an anti-racist. And I would never run into, I don't think I'd run into anybody in a progressive church who would say, well, yeah, I'm kind of racist. But that distinction where somebody might say, well, I'm not a racist, but it's an extra series of steps, I guess, to become an anti-racist. Did you say something about that?
And this is a concept that I certainly didn't grow up with, and I know most people didn't, but I'm so glad it's taking root and it's getting traction. Just last night, Jane Corden, if you know the Late Late Show on CBS, Carpool Karaoke, that's one of his kind of famous, skits that he does. He was speaking to, I believe it was Gayle King, who was a CBS anchor on CBS This Morning, and African-American. And he was saying that and he's English, he grew up in England, but there's racism in the UK, no doubt. He said that I grew up thinking as a white person, a white Brit, that, well, I'm not racist and that's good enough. And he said he has come to understand that that's not good enough. You need to be anti-racist because simply being nice was not going to fix the problem. And that has overwhelmingly been my experience with my white siblings, community members, church members, classmates, etc., co-workers, colleagues. Well, I'm a nice person. And so all that racist stuff has nothing to do with me. If we could just take care of those few bad apples.
Yeah.
And that's not the point. The point is, as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, Black people didn't create the problem. Neither did Latinx folks or any other people of color. And we don't benefit from the problem. White folks benefit from the problem. They get the benefits of white privilege in our society. And so it's not enough then to be, according to that logic, to simply be a nice person and to be non-racist. You have to purposely deconstruct. And so one of the things that there's a great article, and I believe when I was with you guys on that Sunday morning, I mentioned it during the Sunday school hour, by Paula Rothenberg. And she talks about the construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of difference. And in that, she argues that you have to, that the way that the isms have been created, whether it's sexism or heterosexism or racism, etc., that it was purposely constructed that way. That if you go back to the history, you can, through public policy, social mores, church policy, etc., that it was created to be this way. And so we have to spend some time deconstructing it, meaning taking it apart, examining it, checking our own hearts, looking at wherever orbit of influence we have in the boardroom, in the church house, in the schoolhouse, in the community place, wherever we have an orbit of influence, we have to purposely and with intention look at the ways in which racism is perpetuated. And only then can we reconstruct it in a way that is positive. An example of being anti-racist and doing that deconstruction is what we saw in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation gatherings, where persons got together and with immunity to tell of the atrocities committed towards them or ones that they committed towards other people. And it was a way, it wasn't perfect, but it was certainly a valid attempt to deconstruct what had been purposely constructed before you could reconstruct it in kind of positive, healthy way. And to me, that's a bit of what being anti-racist is about. It's about purposely, with intention, deconstructing, making room at the table, sharing power, sharing resources. What you mentioned about inviting persons of color into the pulpit, you don't have to do that. You don't have to make space for that. That is an example of anti-racism. Purposely making space at the table for other people, sharing resources, sharing power. And we don't see nearly enough of it.
Okay. I wonder how long we'll have to wait for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States, or ever.
I just got off a call earlier today in the UCC, the United Church of Canada is a ministerial partner. And so I had to do some continuing ed training for my ministerial standing. And I joined a Zoom call with United Church of Canada. And I was one of just a handful of people from the States. Most of the 50 or more people were from Canada, they were Canadian. And it was just, they began the call by saying, before we begin the meeting, can we please take a moment to recognize that we are on stolen land? And it was a Zoom call, and they said in the chat box, if you know where you live or where you're presently sitting, what land that is. And people, 50, 60 people, began to say, I'm on, and they begin to list different Native or indigenous tribes where their homes or their churches reside. And I thought, that is that is something a part of their national culture. To be able to do that. Very few of us could say, oh, my home is built on the land of the XYZ people, right? We've not been able to unpack that kind of humility. And so it's something in the national culture has to change before we could approach anything like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it's just not a part of who we are.
I'm mostly always, I grew up in Toronto in Canada, and
oh, did you? Okay.
Canada. And I'm mostly pretty proud of what goes on there. And if my job and most of my friends and family were in the United States, I would probably head back to Canada. They had a truth, I don't know if they talked about this in the phone call, but I don't know if it's finished, but they had a Truth and Reconciliation with their First Nations people, with the Aboriginal peoples in Canada. For several years. So let me ask a question that I often get, and I'm never really sure what the best answer is to this. Folks will say, our church is open and affirming, and yet we have very few people of color in our pews.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you have any thoughts on that, on how we could be this open church, this welcoming church, a church with, we've upped our level of hospitality. We often, or not often, but sometimes have people of color visit our church. But our percentage of people of other than white in our congregation is probably like 5 or 6%, which is about the normal range for average range for United Methodists.
This is something dear to my heart. Most of my ministerial appointments when I was in the Methodist tradition, or the ministerial calls I've received since I've been in a congregational setting like the UCC, have been cross-cultural, meaning I hang out with white folks often.
Wow.
Not by design necessarily, but almost by default. And this has been dear to my heart, because what I usually hear in my, the last 15 or so years that I've been doing cross-cultural ministry are well-intentioned, middle class to older, or middle-aged to older white folks, middle class to upper income, well-educated, well-intentioned, say exactly what you said. But why don't we have, and when I say, okay, you have to make the space welcoming. Well, we welcome everybody. What do you mean? We wouldn't turn anybody away. And I'll go, well, that's great. Can we talk about what the chancel looks like? Right? Can we talk, and who's represented? Can we talk about the type of musical selection? Because music is power. Everybody loves jazz. Everybody loves the blues. Everybody loves gospel. I have never met, even an atheist that I know, love a good gospel tune, right? Why don't we sing them in our churches then? If everybody loves them, what is it? And I, even as a senior minister, thought this. I had a minister of music and other members who just didn't get it. Because somewhere ingrained it was the most appropriate way to have church is to be in this kind of high church, European anglicized. And that is one way to have church, but it's not the only way, nor is it the best way. And this is where I get into trouble. Okay, so I'm gonna get into trouble here. That I often don't use the word racism because it's so loaded. I have begun using the word white supremacy, which is also a heavy word, but I think it's more accurate. Most of our churches in our mainline denominations are white supremacists.
Okay.
Even the progressive one. What do you mean by that? That means we center the white experience in the European experience. We center it. We make it not only normalized, we make it the gold standard. And anything outside of that experience is kind of tolerated, condescended a bit, kind of pat you on the, oh, you want to sing some gospel music, oh, and pat you on the head and send you on, right? Or you want to have different instrumentation and on Sunday morning, oh, aren't you cute? Well, we'll do that occasionally on a, and my question is why? Where does it come from? Is it a sense of white superiority, therefore supremacy? Because it's difficult for me to believe when one says we want all people, but the underlying message is as long as they talk like us, speak, sing like us, worship like us, preach like us, administrate like us, as long as they're carbon copies of us, sure, then you're welcome. Come on, we'd love to have you. But as soon as you begin to act differently, so let me give you a couple examples from my own experience, right? So I had some folks join the church. I was the first African-American and openly gay person called by this congregation in the UCC. And the UCC has this well-earned reputation for being much more progressive than most. That's the national level. Individual churches can vary greatly from that. And so we had some folks during the church who had never joined our church before because they were attracted to a different style that I had, which is normal. When you get a new pastor, you get new people often. Well, this one particular woman, who was actually white, by the way, but to her own confession, grew up in a predominantly African-American setting and was raised by an African-American woman. So she began, in my sermons, she began to say, amen, amen. And everyone began to.
Yeah.
And so I had a lovely member who she and her husband were deeply involved in classical music and traveled the world directing choral arrangements. And I mean, they were very highbrow music people, right? Came to me and said, Ray, I think we need to do, and then also after the sermon, she would clap after the sermon, which would lead other people to clap, and it became a thing. So this wonderful woman came to me and said, Ray, I think we need to do something about the clapping. Mm-hmm. And I said, really? What do you propose? Well, don't you think you should say something over the pulpit about it? And I said, let's think about that. I don't know that I'm comfortable doing that. I said, number one, I'm not comfortable quenching anyone's worship expression, right? As long as it's not literally hurting someone else, like, you know. I said, and number two, the scriptures do tell us, oh, clap your hands. And as a good progressive Christian, born and raised in the UCC, she looked at me and she said, oh, I hadn't even thought about the Bible. And one of our more prominent UCC churches is the Riverside Church in New York City in Manhattan. Many people are familiar with the Rockefeller Cathedral, right? And I have friends who were members there when they were in seminary at Union in New York City. And they said that, they had an African-American pastor who left the church in a very contentious way. But one of the things he did was start a gospel choir. And their minister of worship and music and et cetera, and other lay leaders told their pastor that the gospel choir was not allowed to sing in the chancel. They could sing from the floor, but they were not allowed in the chancel because somehow there was a hierarchy in worship expression, and only kind of the high church European anglicized worship was deemed the best, and anything else was deemed somehow deficient. Something's wrong with that. Something's wrong with that.
Did the contemporary Christian music group have to sing outside the door, or did they? They were probably not even
in the basement. In the basement, actually.
Yeah.
In the basement.
Oh, those are just some beautiful ideas for us to think about. And I appreciate you saying it, that it's, and I like the idea that, racism has become such a loaded word, especially for white people to hear that word. It's a derogatory word for many people. And Ibram Kendi again says it's descriptive. It's describing, what's going on. There's all of us have racist ideas.
And you can have racism without the racist. Meaning, I have started saying to folks, what you said or what you did could be seen as racist versus you're a racist. That feels very different, right? I mean, we're hundreds of miles away on Zoom here, but I'm sure that didn't feel good for me to point and say it doesn't feel good, because you can have actions or behavior that is racist without you yourself being a racist, if that makes any sense. And that's where microaggressions come into play. Because a microaggression is the most commonly experienced form of racism. I always tell my students and other workshop participants that it's like when you feel like and you don't quite know what happened or what you're feeling, and you're questioning, was that racist? Like, why did they say that to me? And it's these kind of unconscious or subconscious slights that happen towards people of color, and of course other marginalized groups as well, that is considered to be a microaggression. It's not overt, and sometimes it is subconscious. It wasn't even intentional by the person, the perpetrator, so to speak. But it is a way in which you have treated that person differently and you've spoken to them differently than if they were white.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's considered a microaggression.
Yeah. And, you know, in a couple of years ago in a group where we had about a third white, a third Hispanic, a third Black, and then some other folks in there, I remember a Black woman telling me in the group that the reason that she didn't like to go to, she had friends in white churches and all that, and she'd get invited, you know, why don't you come to church with me? And she referred to what I would now call a microaggression, that she would experience that. And she said, you know, I'd just kind of rather be with my people on Sunday morning. And I now understand that that's what she was talking about.
Yeah, and so like as an example, because sometimes if you aren't familiar with that terminology, you need a concrete example. I had a conference minister who in the congregational setting like the UCC would be like a bishop, who anytime he spoke to Black clergy, everyone else it was good morning, nice to see you. Anytime he spoke to a Black clergy, he'd be 3 or 4 white clergy, and then it'd be a Black lay person or clergy, and he would be like, hey, my brother.
Oh, no. Oh, I just lost it again. Yeah.
Yeah, like what in the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Everyone else got a handshake and a good morning, and now we have this awkward exchange of some kind of secret handshake that I've never heard of.
Oh,
and now I am, you know, it was absolutely ridiculous. Though he was an ally, he considered himself an ally, and his politics were right, so to speak, in the progressive vein of thinking about things. But these were huge microaggressions that you would, like, when you treat someone differently because of their identity, that is a microaggression. Whether it's following someone around the store because you suspect them to be a thief only because of their identity, or whether it is greeting someone in public with this weird, awkward, culturalized, ethnic kind of greeting that no one knows what you're talking about. Those are all, even when they're good intention, or let me touch your hair.
Yeah.
Like, please don't touch my hair. It is the equivalent of, I told a woman once, would you want me to run my fingers through your hair? Isn't that intimate? It was a woman that was a member of my church. And she said, oh, yes, that's intimate for me to say, well, let me run my fingers through your hair. Very intimate, right? That's the same way of asking a Black person, let me pat you and touch your hair. Yeah, that's a microaggression.
Yeah.
And if you wouldn't do that with one of your white colleagues or friends, then please don't do it to a person of color.
Exactly. Ray, all good things must end. And I've so enjoyed talking with you. I've learned so much. We're all learning, right? We're all learning every day.
Well, it's all learning. We all step in it, all right? So if you step in it, clean your shoes off, apologize, and just keep moving forward.
Right. Beautiful. I look forward to your sermon on Sunday morning, and I want to ask you one final question, and I'll give it to you in a multiple choice form. So, during the Fireside Chat, I sometimes close with prayers or benedictions, or maybe sometimes I give a charge about here's something to work on. Would you mind offering one of those three, maybe a prayer or a benediction for this time, or a charge to us?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I leave us with these parting words, that if you know any artist, one of the worst things you can do is to criticize or to devalue their art, even if you don't understand it. We are all the handiwork of God. God is the great creator. So any of God's creation that is devalued pisses God off. So in our honoring of each other, we're actually honoring the creator. Take that and go in peace and in love, and let's work together to make this world a much better place.
Amen and amen.
Amen.
Beautiful closing to this time. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Discussion. Yeah. Yeah.